Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Sound Decisions here on Passion for Sound. As you can see, this video is a little bit different. I'm going to be presenting to you some slides containing some information I've pulled out of an article. This is a research article I wanted to share with you that explains to you why I said in the title of this video that all reviews you've ever seen on IEMs are wrong. Now technically they're not exactly wrong, so it is a little bit of a clickbait title, but it's not entirely off the mark. I'll explain to you shortly why you need to be really careful taking anybody's impressions of an IEM with anything but a grain of salt. I will also talk at the end of the video though about what you can do to get a better sense of which reviews you can trust and which you can't. And it's not about the intentions or the reliability or the validity of the actual reviewer. There's a lot more going on and I'll talk about that in a second. Before I get into it, I do want to say a huge thanks to channel patron Nick, who's actually the one that shared this article in our channel Discord server. We've got a dedicated topic for sound theory where we talk about articles like this one and certain others, so if that's something you're interested in, you might want to jump onto Patreon and check it out for yourself. But for now, I just want to say a huge thanks to Nick for bringing this article to my attention. And the final thing I want to say before I get into the actual article itself is I just wanted to mention, you'll probably see this guy here. This is a Rode pod mic, and I want to say a huge thanks to Rode for sending it over. To be really clear, Rode didn't ask me to review this or anything like that. I contacted the person I've been dealing with at Rode and asked specifically if they had any recommendations for microphones, and they've been kind enough to send it over with no expectations at all, and that's why I specifically wanted to call it out. A, because I was on this occasion granted something for free, but also because it came with no strings attached, and so I wanted to say thank you to Rode for sending this out, and also to let you know what this mic is in the corner of the screen, and also therefore which microphone is providing the sound, so that if you like it, you can consider buying it for yourself. Again, Rode didn't ask me to say that. I also have no specific affiliations with Rode. This is just me acknowledging a really nice gesture that they made to me and the channel. And so with all that said, let's jump in now and talk about the article and the specific measurements and data contained within it to help us understand why all IEM reviews could potentially be wrong for you. This particular article is called Measurement Apparatus and Modelling Techniques of Ear Canal Acoustics, and it's been written by Marco Hipaka, I don't know if I'm saying that right, in November 2008. I've got the link here on screen, but I'll also put a link down in the description below so you can access this full article for yourself. There's a lot of content I'm not going to cover here in this video, so if you're interested in seeing more, do check out the link and read everything there is to know. It goes into all sorts of bits and pieces about how measurements are done, the structure and the anatomy of the ear, all sorts of bits and pieces, so there's lots of reading there. I'm only going to cover the bits that I think are particularly relevant to IEM reviews. And I'm going to start by pulling a quote directly from the article, and it says here, from our research we may conclude that, and here's the key bit, the physical dimensions and especially the length of the ear canal have a considerable effect to the pressure frequency response at the eardrum. Now what this means for us is that the different lengths of people's ear canals and the shape as well, that's going to directly affect how you hear an in-ear monitor, and potentially headphones and speakers as well, but particularly in-ear monitors, as I'll show you shortly. Before I dive into the data and the information that explains why it can affect how we hear IEMs, I just want to talk about the fact that this article also covers a whole lot more ground, as I mentioned earlier, and specifically some things it covers that I'm not addressing here is that we could also all have slightly different angles of our eardrums, and that's going to affect the sound slightly. Also, any tension on the eardrum could affect how we hear, and there are multiple causes for potential tension on the eardrum. And something else that he talks about is the fact that where the measurement is taken can also influence what the measurement shows. And specifically what they're talking about here is measuring the frequency response arriving at the ear, whether it's measured at the opening of the ear canal or at the eardrum, will affect what the end result is. And so what that says to us as well is that when you're seeing measurements of speakers where there is no ear canal potentially being used, it's just a microphone, that's going to be different to what you actually hear by the time it gets filtered by your ear canal. But it also means that if you're ever seeing measurements from a reviewer, for instance, where they might be using an in-ear microphone that sits right at the opening of the ear canal, that's not giving you a true representation of what's happening at the end of that person's ear canal, and specifically also at the end of your ear canal. Now, none of this is to say that people are doing it wrong. The point is there's no easy way to get it right because everybody's different. And let's look at that now. So one of the things that this article points out is that the pinna, that's this flappy bit on the outside of the ears, the pinna works differently for low and high frequencies. So sound waves with a frequency below 1 kHz are not affected by the pinna, but above 1 kHz and especially around 2 to 3 kHz, which is where most speech signals come in, and that's, when I say speech signals, it's the key things that help to make the sounds of consonants, it's the way we form the individual sounds that make us intelligible, those things are specifically boosted by reflections from the pinna. And I've got a bit of a theory here, and this is not talked about anywhere in this article, but what I'm wondering is if there might actually be some natural, biological and anatomical interactions between the shape and size of your pinna and my pinna and what's actually going on inside the ear canal. It's quite possible there are some effects where what is going to be filtered and boosted by the shape and size of our ear canal might be being offset a little bit by the pinna. And I say that because in my experience reviewing earphones and headphones and seeing comments, there seems to be much more range in what people hear from IEMs than there is from headphones. And so by extension, what I'm thinking about that is that maybe when we're putting on a pair of headphones, we're getting both the benefits of the pinna and the ear canal, and maybe they're balancing it out so all of us hear them more similarly. Whereas when we've got an IEM, we're not getting any of the effect of the pinna, and that could be why there's a much broader variation when we're just listening to earphones. Now, if none of that makes sense, don't worry too much about it, it's just a theory I'm playing with. This video is much more focused on the IEMs when the pinna is taken out of the picture, but I did think that this was interesting that the pinna is definitely involved in affecting how we hear certain frequencies. For now though, let's look at the ear canal, because that's the bit that's really relevant for IEMs. Before we dive into the data, it's worth getting a quick visualization and understanding of the anatomy of the ear canal, because we're going to talk a lot about that with some of the different measurements. And the key thing here that I've highlighted from this quote is that there are two more or less pronounced bends within the ear canal itself. And so an ear canal is not a straight tube. Firstly, it's worth noting that every single person has a couple of bends in the canal that may be more or less pronounced. There can be compressions in the canal, so it can get narrower or wider at certain points. And then also the length of the canal can be different. All of these factors come into play to affect how we hear specific sounds. And so let's now start looking at some of these measurements and talk about what they mean for us. As the quote at the top of the page here talks about, the ear canal acts as what they call a quarter wavelength resonator. And so that means that it will actually pick up and resonate, or therefore boost, sound waves that are 4 times the length of the ear canal. And one of the measurements they did as part of this research article was they took an ear canal where they could vary the length of it and took different measurements using wideband signals, so signals across multiple frequencies, to see where there were particular peaks or troughs in the sound that they measured. As you can see from the graph here, we've got 4 different lengths. We've got 12mm, 16mm, 20 and 24mm, and in each case, changing the length of the ear canal changed where there were resonant peaks. So for example, in the 24mm case, which was the green, there was a peak at around about just above the 3K mark, there was a peak, and then there was a secondary peak just below 10K. And so what that's telling us is that if you had an ear canal that was 24mm long, and in this case it was dead straight, you would hear a greater sense of energy and sound at just above the 3 kHz mark, and again just below the 10 kHz mark. In contrast to that, if you were somebody with a 12mm long ear canal, what you would find is that you would be more sensitive, i.e. you would hear more energy between 5 and 6 kHz, and then again, as we can see it's starting to disappear off the page, but again up around the 12 kHz mark. And so all of this goes to show that every factor in the ear canal, so the length, the shape, the compression, as we'll get to soon, all of this can change how you hear compared to how I hear. If we use this as a very simple example, if I had an IEM in my ears and I had a 24mm ear canal, I might be overly sensitive to the fact that it's got a boost at about 3K. You might put that same IEM in your ear canal, which might be say 12 or 15mm long, and listen to it and go, well, Lachlan, what are you talking about? There's no peak there. On the flip side, you might say, yeah, but I really don't like the sound up at around about the 5 or 6K mark, because that's where your sensitivity lies. And so hopefully you're already starting to see why this is an issue, but it's much more complex than just this one graph. So let's take a look at a few more. This next graph starts to look at compressing the ear canal. And so here they took a straight ear canal that was 30mm in length and 8mm in diameter, and they took one measurement with it being left alone and another where they compressed the middle part of it. And as you can see, just applying compression, which is the blue line, completely changed the frequency response of that tube. Firstly, it became a lot more irregular, but probably more importantly from a psychoacoustic point of view, and what I mean by that is the sounds we actually hear, the person who has an ear canal that is compressed compared to the one that is straight, assuming they're both exactly the same length, the person with that compressed ear canal is getting a boost of about 1 to 3 dB at around about the 2.5 kHz range. On the flip side, they're also getting a cut at around about the 7 kHz range, And so there's going to be a big difference between how two people with these different ear canals would hear a particular IEM. And so far we've said that the length makes a difference, and now also we're adding in that the sense of compression or lack of compression also makes a difference in what you hear. If we then move on and talk about the third factor in ear canal shape, we're now talking about straight versus bent ear canals. Now most people won't have dead straight ear canals, but the degree to which your ear canal bends more or less will directly affect how you hear sounds. In this case, we've kept it nice and simple again. They've just got a straight canal versus a bent canal. And you can see looking at the graph that bending the canal massively cuts the upper frequencies, but it also changes where there are resonant peaks. So if you had the bent canal in the black line there, you would have a slight peak at around about 2 kilohertz, and then another slight peak just before, I think that's the 5 kilohertz range. So you're going to have those two peaks and then a big drop off. On the other hand, if your canal was more straight, you're going to have a much bigger peak between 2 and 3 kilohertz, and then another peak up around 8 kilohertz. And so as you can see, again, we've got these multiple factors that are changing the way we hear sound. Moving on to another set of data, and this one's actually from real people. So it's quite indicative, I think, as to what we all hear differently. At first glance, you might look at these and say, yeah, they're all roughly the same shape, but let's take a moment to look at the specific differences. What we have here are 3 people, and they've taken measurements of both their left and their right ear canal resonances, or frequency responses you could call it. And what we can see is that in the first person up the top, this is called subject 5, what we've got is the signal has been measured at about a minus 50 dB range, starting from down around, 50 hertz they've started measuring. And so that's going to run pretty much flat all the way up to about 110 hertz before it drops away, and then we get this other peak up the top. So that peak is happening for this person at about 10, 9, 8, 7, about 6 kilohertz, just below 6 kilohertz, and then on we go. Keeping in mind some of those landmarks, so we've got this flat base from 50 through to about 110 hertz. If we now jump down here, notice what we're seeing differently. If we ignore the roll-off in this person's left ear canal, what we can see is that their bass response is generally quite dropped compared to subject 5. So with the same input signal, we're getting a frequency response of minus 60 dB at 50 hertz compared to minus 50 over here, so that's a 10 dB difference. And then instead of it starting flat and then rolling off, subject 6 actually climbs up all the way until they get to around about the 500-600 hertz mark, and then they drop away a bit higher up. So thinking about what these two people would hear if they put an IEM in their ear, subject 5 might find an IEM that they feels a bit boomy, a bit overdone in the bass. But then if they were to give that same IEM over to subject 6, they might say it's just right, because all of a sudden the IEM is making up for their natural frequency response. And now to be clear, as I understand it, this is not the person's hearing ability. This is not mapping what their brain is doing with the information. It's purely mapping what is going on in terms of the resonance within the ear canal itself. So this person, subject 6, has an ear canal that boosts the mid-range but rolls off the bass. The person over here who's subject 5, they've got an ear canal that's got fairly solid bass, but then it actually rolls off through the mid-range a bit. If we then come down to subject 3, we see a different picture again. They've got a much higher overall level, starting at minus 40 dB, and I'm assuming that all these were measured with the same input volume. But what this person, subject 3, has is a bass that actually picks up through the mid bass and then rolls off down into the mids in much the same way as subject 5 did. So all 3 of these people are going to be perceiving bass differently, and that's before we even start to look at the treble, which is also a bit different for all 3. But before we start looking at the treble here, I want to show you some different graphs that give us a better understanding of how the treble's being influenced. What we're looking at here is 2 different graphs focusing on the range from 1 kHz to 20 kHz, and then considering the impact of having compression near the opening of the canal or towards the end of the canal at the eardrum. And specifically what we can see in this top left graph is that if the compression of the ear canal occurs towards the opening of the ear canal, it's going to be influencing a little bit around this 1 to 2K mark, and then again having another significant influence up around the 5, 6, 7K mark. And so if you had a more straight ear canal, you're going to be more sensitive to sounds up in this sort of 5, 6, 7 kilohertz range, and maybe a little bit less sensitive in this 1 to 2, maybe 2.5 kilohertz range. What you then might also have though is some compression towards the eardrum. And in the case of the compression more towards the eardrum, you can see that it's actually more affecting the whole frequency range. And in this case, as you get compression closer to the eardrum, it's going to make you more sensitive to the sounds from say 1 kilohertz up to around about 6 or 7 kilohertz. And then it'll start to make you less sensitive to sounds in the 7, 8, 9 and 10 kilohertz range. And so hopefully by now you're getting a really clear picture of the fact that every single person's ears are going to be hearing a pair of IEMs differently. And potentially headphones and speakers too. But as I said before, I think there's a few other factors going on in terms of the way our pinna might be reflecting different sounds. So for instance, if the pinna is altering how much of the different frequencies are coming into our ear, there could be some natural anatomical filtering going on that's helping, for example, somebody that might also have a highly compressed ear canal near the opening, their pinna might be helping to boost some of these frequencies that are a bit cut. And so I have a theory that the pinna might be offsetting what you're seeing here. And therefore, when you put a pair of IEMs in your ears and you're bypassing the pinna, you're not getting the benefit of that. And that's why in my theory that I've got, we're having much more variation in what we're hearing from IEMs. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter, so don't get too caught up on my theory. What matters is that hopefully what you're seeing here is that every single person hears IEMs differently, and it's an anatomical, biological fact. And so let's talk now about what that means for us. Firstly, it means that you hear differently to me and every other reviewer. So you can't 100% trust that when I say X IEM sounds like this, that it's going to be exactly the same for you. But that doesn't mean you should throw out every single review you've ever read or watched or stop looking at reviews. What it does mean is that you need to find reviews that you can consistently relate to, either liking or disliking, agreeing or disagreeing, but it's about the consistency. If I consistently say an IEM is too bright and you think it's great, then at least you've got a really good benchmark. And you know that every IEM that I think is too bright is going to be just right for you. So it's about finding that sense of consistency as you watch more and more reviews or read reviews from different people. What it also means though is that you absolutely need to take all measurements with a huge pinch of salt, and especially measurements from different sources. If you start to get a handle on a particular person's measurements and how they relate to you, again, a bit like what I said before, if you're finding consistency that when their graph looks like this, you like it or you don't like it, that's fine. But you need to keep in mind that different measurement rigs have different designs. Some of them have very short, very straight ear canals, like my mini DSP ears rigs, whilst others are much more anatomically correct, but again, they're not correct to your ear canal, they're correct to some general average ear canal. And so measurements are a great tool for comparing one device to another when they're measured on the exact same rig with the exact same settings, because then you can look at it and say that one's got more treble than that one, or that one's got more bass than that one, and that's where it's useful. But trying to pick whether you're going to like an IEM based on one standalone measurement where you may not know the ins and outs of the measurement rig and the calibration applied, that's just asking for trouble, because your ear canal is going to be so different to the measurement rig. That also leads us to the fact that things like the Harman target curve are only somewhat helpful, because that target curve cannot possibly take into account how your ears hear the sound. And a case in point is me. I generally find that most things tuned to the Harman target curve closely have too much upper mid-range emphasis. And that's not to say that those things are tuned wrongly or the Harman target curve is wrong. Is to say that for my ears and the resonance of my ear canals, that specific tuning isn't ideal. And so this is another one where it's important for you to work out if that is a target curve that works for you or if it's not. And there's no right and wrong there. It's about understanding how your personal hearing differs from everybody else's. And so my final point as I wrap this video up is to say that the key takeaway for me is to not hesitate to stick with exactly what you love, no matter what anyone else says. If you have an IEM that you love and someone else says it's a boomy, bassy mess and you don't hear it that way, it's probably because your ear canal is different from theirs. And in other words, they've never heard the IEMs with your ears, they can't comment. So stick with what you love, ignore people that criticize you for what you do love, ignore reviews that tell you that it's not as good as what you think it is, because they've never heard it with your ears. And so hopefully this video has given you a really good sense of why IEM reviews in particular and IEM measurements in particular have to be treated very carefully, but also given you some ideas as to how you can use them effectively. And specifically, it's about getting a benchmark. It's about getting a point of consistent reference so you can understand what works for you and doesn't work for you by understanding how your hearing specifically differs from the reviewer or the measurements you're seeing. And so I hope you found this video useful and informative. If you have, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. If you've got any questions, do post them down in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. And remember, I've put a link through to the full article in the description so you can check that out if you want to know more detail. For now though, let me leave you to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.